All right, it's a real pleasure to introduce David Sherman today. David's a professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He received his Ph.D. at Stanford. His undergraduate degree was at Cornell, and he did a postdoc at UCLA. First of all, he's a great guy. I've known him since he walked into my office in Bassfield in the 1990s. We're not sure exactly when that was, and he borrowed a tape that I developed in one of my HIV prevention interventions called People Like Us, using social comparison theory to get people to feel vulnerable to HIV, and David did some other variants and things with it after that. David's work is in a couple of different areas. He's used self-affirmation in very important ways in the educational process to increase student achievement, and some work that's had terribly important impact. Other work has been using self-affirmation in the area of health. He's also done some cross-cultural work on social support and how it's used and on relationships in different cultures. And finally, he's done some work on group polarization, which is terribly important in today's highly polarized and disturbing environment. So it's a pleasure to introduce him. I think and this work, I think, is terribly interesting and important for anybody who does intervention. And it begs to be used in a lot of intervention contexts where it hasn't been used to date. So, thank you.
Well, thank you, Jeff. Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here. I'm a native of Connecticut, and so it's wonderful to come to UConn. This past summer, Jeff and I had the pleasure of working with Jeff, and we co-taught a class on interventions at the Summer Institute for Social and Personality Psychology at USC. And we spent 2 weeks together with a group of Ph.D. students working with them on their interventions. But in so doing, I felt like I was a student as well. I learned so much, not just from Jeff's work, which is amazing and inspiring, but also the work that's gone on here at InCHIP, as Jeff shared a lot of the process and some of the talks that have occurred here and a lot of the research that's been done here. So it's a delight to be here with you all. All right, so in my talk today, I have 3 goals. Hopefully we get through. First, my goal is to provide an overview of self-affirmation theory. I'm going to try to briefly review some of the older studies that we've done and present some of the newer work on health, stress, and coping. Second, would like to show how we've moved over the years from work that's been done primarily in the laboratory into more field studies to look at more real-world health outcomes in stress and in coping. And third, I'd like to share some of what we've learned over the year about the mechanisms of self-affirmation. I'll be a little bit lighter on that in this talk. Happy to focus on that in terms of questions. What are some of the underlying processes by which affirmations lead to more adaptive outcomes? So the core of the theory and the approach is trying to understand how people respond to information or events that threaten how they see themselves in some way. And threats to the self are ubiquitous and often related to health. So at UCSB, we sadly hear on a very regular basis about students who suffer the negative consequences from alcohol abuse, binge drinking. Every year we hear of 1 or 2 or sometimes more students who have very serious consequences from their drinking. And so you could think about this both from the threats that may lead them to drink as a coping mechanism, but also how do people process the information that the universities provide to try to get them to reduce their binge drinking. Threats to the self can happen in the medical context. when you get a diagnosis that you have a disease. For example, we've been doing some work recently with women with breast cancer. A diagnosis that has the potential to change how you see yourself and how others see you. And threats to the self also stem from living with stigma. This is a picture from Lesotho, South Africa, where or near South Africa, where we've begun to do some research with people who are living with HIV and living with the stigma of HIV. So how do people cope with these information or events that threaten how they see themselves in some way? The basic model that we draw from is this idea of a motivated self system. You can think of the self in that big center of it as possessing the different domains and relationships and characteristics that constitute who we are. And it has an overarching goal to maintain an image of the self as being a capable, motivated, efficacious, adaptive person. The goal of this motivated self-system is not to be greater or better than others. When we talk about affirmation, it isn't like to exalt the self, but exalt the self, but rather to be good enough in these important domains of life, health or politics, to feel efficacious about your family or your work status. To understand threats to the self, I think it's helpful to think about, in particular, what happens when people deal with some sort of acute threatening information. So you're a college student and you get some information about the negative consequences of drinking, and that this could put your health at risk, that your drinking could put you at risk for negative consequences, for failing out of school or being at risk for negative health outcomes. Now, because to the extent that being a healthy person is an important self-image, this has the potential to engulf your entire view of yourself, to think about yourself as defined solely in terms of this particular domain when you get this acute threatening information. And the goal then, however, is not necessarily to respond to each and every threat, but to maintain an overall view of yourself as being capable and adaptive. And so people can respond to threats in one part of their life by affirming themselves in another part of their life. There are many routes to self-integrity. And this happens all the time. You have a difficult day at work and you go home and you play with your kids, or you go work out at the gym, or you listen to music or some other thing. What we believe this does is, in addition to being a source of entertainment and fun, it also affirms who you are. It reminds you of what is important to you and the things in your life that define who you are. So when people experience this type of affirmation activity, what then happens to that initial threatened domain? Our hypothesis is that when people experience an affirmation of this overall view of themselves as being capable and adaptive, then it reduces the pressure to respond to any particular threat in a defensive way that minimizes that particular potential risk. Social psychologists have done a great job of identifying all the defensive strategies that people engage in order to mitigate threats to the self-image. And oftentimes this leads to a reduction in perceived risk, saying, no, that couldn't happen to me. The hypothesis of the affirmation model is that if you can affirm yourself in some other domain of life, it'll reduce the pressure to respond defensively in any particular domain. And consequently, people might be more even-handed and open-minded to otherwise threatening information. With my collaborator, Jeff Cohen, we wrote a review paper where we described a couple of the pathways by which affirmation may lead to adaptive change. And one is by just what I said, by reducing defensiveness and making people more open to otherwise threatening information. Another pathway is by reducing stress or buffering people from stress. Again, the idea is that often what makes things stressful is that you see your entire self-system as tied to that particular event or domain, whether it's health or whether it's a particular performance. But reminders of this broader sense of who you are can reduce the stress that could come from that particular domain that is activated. So the hypothesis generated from this line of reasoning is that affirmations of the self should do these two things, should make people more open to otherwise threatening health information, and may help people cope with stressors in their lives, whether it's an acute stressful situation or a more chronic naturalistic stressor. How do we operationalize this? How do we move from this sort of broad ideas to something a little more concrete? Often our affirming activities take the form of written exercises. Here is an affirmation activity that we've had college students do. We first ask them to rank these values in terms of how important they are. And we have a list of a wide range of values and personal characteristics. Things like relations with friends and family, but spontaneity, living life in the moment, social skills, music, art, athletics. These are things that are important to people, that define how they see themselves, and we get them to rank them so that ideographically we get some sense of what is most important to each of those people in the moment. And then we ask them to write, what is your most important? And please describe this personal characteristic and a time in your life when this value was particularly important. Don't worry about spelling or grammar, just write for 10 or 15 minutes about this value, why it's important to you, and times when this has been particularly important. Okay, here's some examples of some quotes. Look at the one from the college students. How can I get by without friendship or family? I know I couldn't, I need that support. At times it feels like the only thing I have that's real. The love and comfort from relationships is something that's always nice. And the person gives an example of when their family was particularly supportive or helped them through a difficult time. Okay, so what's the purpose, the logic behind using this type of values writing for our affirmation manipulation? First, we think that it provides a perhaps rare opportunity to take a step back and reflect upon these internalized values and important aspects of the self. I mean, how often do we really take a time out and write about who we are and what's important to us and why? Okay? It might seem like a relatively small thing, but the act of writing, but these values are obviously crucially important to how we see ourselves. Another aspect of this methodology in particular is that the content is self-generated, and it's tailored to tap into each person's particular most important value. It isn't general, and it isn't me telling you that you possess these values. It's you generating the information yourself and reflecting upon what is most important to you. And we think that this provides a psychological time out, a moment to sort of break away from the stress that you might be otherwise considering, and give people, in turn, a sort of broader perspective on things, see things more in terms of the forest than the trees. Okay, so how have we studied this? So I'll talk about one of the first studies that we did. I was a first-year graduate student, and I was reading for my social psych class, Claude Steele's Self-Affirmation theory. And there was a part in the paper that said, and I remember it quite well, saying that salient self-affirming thoughts should make people more objective about other threatening information. And I immediately thought back to being an undergrad myself and going to the dorm room AIDS educational venues where they would show some scary video or have this kind of scary information designed to get you to be safer, to convince you that HIV and AIDS was something that could happen to you. When I was a college student, it was right after a time that Magic Johnson was just diagnosed, and this was something that was salient, and that was how they did it. That was how the communications were made. And it just struck me as something that was likely to make students feel defensive and say, no, this couldn't happen to me. But maybe this idea that was proposed in the theory paper, which hadn't been looked at in the health domain, that if you could get people to write about salient self-affirming thoughts, it might make people more objective or more open to the health information. And I remember looking through the literature, okay, what's been done? And came across Jeff Fisher's work and on the IMB model, and asked if I could use the videotapes in the study. The videotape that he sent was the People Like Us video. And as I was doing a little further literature review at this time, I found this paper by Morse and Swan that suggested that these videos, particularly when they're in isolation, which is kind of that experience that I had as a student, not embedded in a larger intervention program like an IMB program, but those videos can prompt these defensive health or defensive risk assessments. Can get people to not do what you want with the information, but say, no, that couldn't happen to me. So we put the two things together for a study. The participants were sexually active college students, and I had them engage in that similar prompt as I showed you before. Half of them wrote about the important value and at times in their life when this value was particularly important. The other half in the control condition wrote about relatively unimportant values, why they might be important to someone else. And then we showed them a short section of People Like Us. And afterwards, we gave them a number of dependent variables. In particular, asked them, did they get the message? Could they see AIDS as something that could happen to people like them? Okay, so along the y-axis is the perceived risk for HIV. And we see that the no affirmation condition was significantly less likely to say that HIV was something that could happen to people like myself than those who wrote this affirming essay. We also had this data from them on pretest, so we could see where the change was. The control condition was at that same level. So despite seeing this video, they didn't change their risk at all. But the affirmation condition was also at about the level of the control condition, about 2.8. After seeing this video, they were more likely to increase their risk, perceived risk. Would this translate into safer sexual behaviors? Well, it wasn't something that we could easily measure, but what we were able to do was create a kind of a proxy whether they would be interested in purchasing condoms if we gave them the opportunity. So we paid them a few dollars for the study, and then we provided a big jar of condoms and told them that you could purchase them for the same price that they were selling at the health center, 10 cents each. I'm going to leave as the experimenter, left them in the privacy of the cubicle so that they could purchase the condoms, and then afterwards we'd go and dump the jar out and see whether or not they did in fact purchase them in the privacy of the cubicle. And what we found was that 50% of the affirmed participants purchased condoms, whereas 25% of the control participants purchased condoms. So this study was published in 2000, and since that time there have been many, many similar demonstrations that affirming activities can lead people to be more open to otherwise threatening health information. Here are two meta-analyses that came out by other scholars in the journal Health Psychology in 2015. One of them by Epton and Peter Harris and colleagues who've been doing a lot of studies in the UK, but this meta-analysis over 46 studies found an average effect size D of about 0.3 on the impact on the main effect of affirmation on adaptive health behaviors. With graduate student Phil Arrett, who is a Ph.D. student in our program at UCSB, I'm his advisor, we have sought to broaden the perspective to see how affirmations could be potentially integrated in different public health exercises. We looked at this in the context of exercise and obesity, what work has been done on that, in the context of alcohol use, in the context of cigarette labels. In all these different domains, studies have been done that have generally showed that affirmation makes people more open to information that they might otherwise reject. Empirically, we want to look at this specifically in the context of alcohol use. As I mentioned before, this is an acute issue at University of California, Santa Barbara. We are currently the 11th ranked party school in terms of the Princeton Review's top 20 party schools. UConn didn't make the list this year. Yeah, so you guys are doing good work here. You know, So, so in thinking about this, and Phil, who's been terrific to work with and had a background in alcohol interventions. He worked in motivational interviewing as a paid research assistant before coming to work with me in my lab. And based on that, you know, we thought that the students, when we talk with them and study what leads to this problematic drinking, one, they have a lack of motivation to stop. You know, they want to keep drinking. It's college, it's party time. This is why I came to UCSB in part for some students. So they're not sufficiently motivated. But even if they are motivated, they lack the behavioral skills to just stop, for example, drinking or stop drinking excessively, to moderate the skills it takes in the setting where there's a lot of pressure to drink. We put together a review paper that tried to integrate the theoretical ideas of self-affirmation in the process of motivational interviewing as one way, potentially, to deal with people at the kind of high end of the addiction spectrum who are trying to reduce their alcohol use. And motivational interviewing is used in the clinical context to try to get people to reduce it. So we tried to integrate ideas conceptually. Thus far, there haven't been any empirical demonstrations linking the affirmation and motivational interviewing, but in this paper we outline how we think it could work together. But empirically, we first wanted to conduct a laboratory study where we could see whether we could create an affirmation and use it in hopefully synergistically with some other techniques that have been established in the field. It had been established in a number of studies that affirmation can reduce drinking behavior, intentions to reduce drinking and actual drinking behavior in kind of a main effect way. And we thought that this supports the idea that this could speak to sort of the motivational component, the motivational need to change. But it doesn't speak much to the skills that are needed to actually change. And for this, we want to see whether an affirmation could be paired with implementation intentions. Implementation intentions are the specific plans on how, when, and where people will engage in a behavioral change technique. Peter Gollwitzer's work on implementation intentions has shown that it could be very effective strategies for getting people to commit to actions that change their behavior. So an example of an implementation intention is typically an if-then statement. If I'm going to play drinking games, then I will only drink one beer and stop playing when it's finished. Okay? So a specific if-then statement that when I'm in a situation, this is what I'll do. And when people make a commitment to that, it leads to a greater likelihood of actually changing the behavior. Now, a number of studies that actually try to combine affirmation and implementation intentions with mixed results. And we thought that there were a few things that we could incorporate into a study that might make it more effective if we were to link them. So here's the study we ran. We had 300 college students. They were drinking, they all were drinkers. They averaged about 11 drinks per week in the past week at baseline. And we ran a 2-by-2 study. So they were either affirmed or not. I'll show you what that looks like. And they either made implementation intentions or general intentions. So the outline of the study is first they reported their weekly drinking, and we gave them the control or writing task. We did all these studies in the laboratory at UCSB. Then they read an article highlighting the consequences of drinking, and we gave them practical strategies to reduce drinking. And then they created either implementation intentions or more general intentions. And then all participants were surveyed 1 or 2 weeks after to see whether it had any effect. Okay, so the self-affirmation, please describe why this life domain or characteristic is important to you, similar to the one I saw before. My most important value was my family and friends and our relationships. Life really means nothing if you don't have important relationships with people, particularly your family members. Okay, then they read an article about the dangers of college drinking. You could think of this as sort of the information component of the model. It gave them the basic facts, many of which they know, but elaborated on the basic facts of the problematic drinking going on campus and the consequences that happen from excessive drinking. And then we tried to provide the behavioral skills, the behavioral strategies. The students all listed the common ideas, common problems that occur, or common situations where they're drinking, so at bars or during frat parties or drinking games. And then we provided different protective behavioral strategies, so eating before drinking, not playing drinking games. Okay, here's how we created the implementation intentions in this study. So they had generated all of these specific situations where they have problematic drinking problems, potentially. So you said the two most common drinking situations are a house party or a bar, okay? What are the most problematic behaviors that happen there? Over drinking, drinking shots, playing drinking games. Okay, what could you do to avoid this? Okay, I could avoid the drinking games. I could eat before I drink. Okay, so now we would like you to think about what you are going to do when you are in that situation. If, and then it populated with what they said before, if I'm asked to take shots at the bar, then I will say no and drink a beer instead. This will be helpful. And this is what we thought some of the other studies may have been lacking, was a connection to the overall bigger picture of why they might want to reduce drinking. This will be helpful because it will help me drink not so much that I get sick. Okay? For the general intentions, we had the same basic idea, but they didn't make that specific if-then link. Okay? So they just expressed what they might do and why it would be helpful, but they didn't make that concrete if-then statement. Okay, so along the y-axis, we asked the students how much they drank in the previous week, and the results indicated that the largest difference was observed in the amount of students who abstained from drinking overall. So the DV here is the percent who abstained in the previous week. Okay, so we see that in the control condition, 17% did. The implementation intentions raised that to 31%. Among the affirmed, the control was 26%, but the combined intervention led to the greatest abstinence of drinking, 41%. So what we observed here was two main effects. One further week, and this was 1 week after the study. 2 weeks after the study, we saw a similar pattern of results. The strongest condition is the condition with the combined affirmation and implementation intentions. At this point, only a main effect of affirmation is significant. The implementation intentions was no longer significant, but it's the same basic pattern of results. All right, so this is an example of something that we think is sort of the next generation of the affirmation work. The first is representing those meta-analyses, was looking at the main effects. The second generation is trying to combine them with other aspects, other theoretical approaches, such as implementation intentions or otherwise, in order to potentially serve as catalysts to let those other interventions or approaches be more effective. So I'd like to switch now to the line of work looking at the impact of affirmations on the reduction of stress. The initial studies that we did which I started when I was at UCLA with David Creswell, who is now a professor at Carnegie Mellon University, and a team of collaborators there, looked at whether giving people the opportunity to reflect upon their core values when they're going through an acute stressful situation. We used the Trier social stress paradigm. So people had to give a speech in front of a hostile audience and count backwards from 7,025 by 13s. And every time they made a mistake, they would have to go back to 7,025. And this has been shown to raise cortisol levels. It did so to a lesser extent when people had the opportunity to complete a questionnaire where they affirmed their core values. So that was the first study that we did looking at this. Next, we want to see whether this would extend from a kind of acute laboratory stressor to more chronic naturalistic stressors. And this was a study, the second one here, which we conducted at UCSB, second one here, looking at the effect of self-affirmation on sympathetic nervous system responses to naturalistic stressors. So let me tell you a little bit what we did. So this was a 2+ week longitudinal study. At the beginning of the study, we had the students come into the conference room and we asked them, what is the exam that you are most stressed out about this quarter? Okay, write down, what's the date of that? Okay, and that was the point that we would focus on, that was the kind of focal stressor for the study. We told them that as part of the study, we're going to collect information about stress hormones. And in particular, we're going to ask you to collect your urine for 15 hours, doing an overnight urine assessment. What we were trying to get at here was how kind of chronically activated their sympathetic nervous system would be, and this would be reflected in increases in catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine, which we can assay from their 15-hour urine assessments. Students said, okay, I'll collect my pee for 15 hours. We gave them these big containers to go do. We told them that the key thing is, when you wake up, start 15 hours before, and then we're going to collect it all. And we're going to do it twice. We did it once on day one, and then once right before this really stressful midterm exam, the one that they thought was that they were most stressed out about. And then in the intervening 2 weeks, we sent them affirmation or control activities via email for them to complete at home. So the students wrote about online, and they wrote about values that they had indicated as being important in the affirmation condition, or relatively unimportant values in the control condition. Okay. All right, so along the y-axis, we have the epinephrine levels. This is the red is the pre-test and blue is the post-test. And we see that in the control condition, people were more stressed out. They had higher epinephrine levels. We saw a similar pattern with norepinephrine. I'll focus on the epinephrine results here. However, in the affirmation condition, this was attenuated. They were not as stressed out at the post-test relative to the pre-test when they completed the 2 affirmation activities during the week. We want to see if this was particularly stressful for different segments within our sample. And so during the baseline, we gave a measure of college concerns. So how concerned are you about being negatively evaluated in the college setting? In college, I worry that people will think I'm unintelligent if I do poorly. I sometimes worry that people will dislike me. Okay? We thought that for this group, they would be the ones who would be most psychologically vulnerable and showed the greatest increase in stress levels connected with the big exam. Okay, so along the x-axis here, we have the college concerns low to high, and along the y-axis is the post-test epinephrine, controlling for the pre-test epinephrine. And what you see is that the difference between the affirmation and the control condition is really driven by these people who had this stronger concerns about the negative evaluation in college. So the red line shows that those who were over here, we see that those who had high college concerns in the control condition had the greatest epinephrine levels on the day of the big exam. But they were also the ones who were most buffered by the affirmation. Those people who were less concerned, it didn't make a difference. They were relatively unstressed out, and the affirmation had relatively no impact. We followed up by asking them about how they were perceiving the exam. The affirmed were less likely to say, I often ruminated, or I thought about what would happen if I failed during that big exam. The affirmed were more likely to say, when taking the exam, I had the attitude, if I don't know it now, there's no point worrying about it. Okay, so what it seems as though the affirmation helped reduce the kind of meta-level concerns that people had that at times can make stressors worse. It's not just the stressful situation itself, but it's sort of ruminating and thinking about that during the stressful event. Okay, so next we want to see if you look at a group that's experiencing a more serious and chronic threat, health threat, whether affirmation writing would be associated with positive health outcomes. So this was a project that was a reanalysis of some intervention work that was done by Annette Stanton at University of Kansas, where she did this expressive writing, emotional expressive writing trial, where women who were just diagnosed with early stage breast cancer, they participated in this trial, and there were 3 different conditions. They wrote 4 essays during a 3-week period about either their deepest thoughts and feelings, their perceived benefits, or in the control condition, the facts about their cancer treatment. And in this study, she found, in this primary study, which was published in 2002, that both of the intervention conditions relative to the control condition led to reductions in physical symptoms and cancer-related doctor visits. We took the content of all of this writing and developed a coding scheme to see whether or not those who seem to affirm core values in the content of their writing would show a greater reduction in the physical symptoms and the cancer-related doctor visits. So we defined self-affirmation here as a positive reflection on a valued self-domain. These are the different categories with which we coded the affirmation essays. And then we looked to see whether the essays that were judged by expert raters as more affirming were the ones that were more beneficial for the participants. Okay. What we saw was that there was the more self-affirmation writing that occurred in these different conditions, across conditions, the more self-affirmation writing that people engaged in, the lower were their physical symptoms, and they had fewer visits to the doctor. We conducted further analyses to see whether or not the beneficial effects of the expressive writing trials and the benefit finding trials were mediated by this self-affirmation writing. And in fact, that's what the results suggested, suggesting that this might be a mechanism by which other writing interventions lead to the beneficial outcomes. Of course, this is a correlational study. We didn't manipulate self-affirmation as we've done in the other experiments. And that's something that we're interested in doing now. Along with the Cancer Center of Santa Barbara, Kimberly Hartson, who was a Ph.D. student with me at the time, collected a small pilot sample of 26 women who were recently diagnosed with breast cancer. And we randomly assigned them to either write affirming essays over the course of 6 months or control activities. The results are kind of pilot and preliminary because of the small sample size. We're using it to try to apply for a broader grant proposal. In fact, we have a grant that we submitted along with David Creswell with a bigger team and a bigger cancer center at Carnegie Mellon and University of Pittsburgh. But what the results suggested, over time, we asked people to complete daily diaries about their cancer experience. And on days when people felt more sick, they felt less optimistic in the control condition. But in the affirmation condition, they felt still just as sick. You know, they had good days and bad days, but it was less connected to their optimism and their feelings for the future. This pattern of results, that the correlations, the within-person correlations that you see very strongly in the control condition were not observed in the affirmation condition, is a mechanism that we've seen in a number of different threatening domains. In the educational setting, we see that when kids feel stressed out, in the control condition, they feel less academic efficacy. But in the affirmation condition, they're still experiencing these stressors, but it's less tied to their academic efficacy. It's like the affirmation provides a way of coping with this that doesn't lead to the negative consequences that stressful events might otherwise lead to. The last study I'd like to share is one that Kim Hartson conducted while she was on a Fulbright fellowship that we designed and put together during her last year of graduate school. She's now a postdoc at the Center for AIDS Prevention Studies at University of California, San Francisco. And it was really an opportunity to kind of come full circle with this first study that I did, looking at AIDS education at this very low-risk sample with college students. Kim's passion in life has to study public health and bring a social psychological perspective to public health issues. And so she got the Fulbright to go to Lesotho, which has one of the highest AIDS incidence rates in the world. So 25% of the adult population is HIV positive. In this small country, which is within South Africa, so it's a little landlocked country within South Africa, you have 330,000 people living with HIV, and 53% of the adults are on antiretroviral treatments. So during the Fulbright year, Kim designed this study and worked with the local government to get IRB approval and worked with the local counseling teams in order to implement the study. And they want to see whether or not among HIV positive individuals, a similar type of brief affirmation could reduce some of the stress and distress associated with HIV and potentially improve their intentions to engage in safer behavior. And did this within the context of a positive living with AIDS counseling session. So let me tell you a little bit more about that. She recruited 10 participants from 10 clinics working with Lenoso, which is an NGO that provides this positive living with AIDS counseling. So she worked with the people who were already embedded in the community, who were already delivering this information, and added to their positive living with AIDS program by having them engage in affirming activities. So the study was integrated into these counseling sessions. There's a picture of Kim and one of the clinic counselors who helped administer the materials. They translated all the study materials into the local language, and she trained all the clinic counselors to administer the study materials. Ended up getting a sample of 331 participants. Okay, so in the control condition, they didn't do any activity. So we didn't want to potentially interrupt what was ever going on with a control writing activity. In the affirmation condition, we told the participants that there are a lot of things that are important to people, things that make their lives better, happier, special. Some people really enjoy and value the time they spend with their family or friends. Others think something that they are good at or just enjoy is really important. In the space below, please write about something that's important to you in your life. Feel free to write as much or as little as you want. So we didn't import our values from the college student study. We just wanted to let them generate what they thought was most important to them. Okay. The dependent variables, we ask them their perceived stress, intrusive thoughts related to HIV. So how much are you thinking about it? And intentions to live positively. Okay. So what we found was that those in the who got the affirmation as part of this positive living with AIDS counseling perceived less stress at the moment. They reported fewer intrusive thoughts about AIDS and HIV. And then we asked them kind of related to the content of the message. The positive living with AIDS skills that were imparted focused on adherence to your medication and intentions to use condoms. And overall, the levels were very high. In the context of this positive living with AIDS, they reported very high intentions to use condoms. It was slightly, but significantly higher among those who completed the affirmation. And a similar pattern for those for the intentions to take your full medication regimen. Okay, so what this study suggests is that possibly some of the psychological burden that's associated with the threatened self-image and the stigma associated with HIV in this context could have been attenuated by affirming these other core aspects of who you are. And potentially this already functioning existing program could be augmented by including affirming activities. It didn't cost much to add this to the existing program, mostly in the context of training and writing activities. And we're currently, digging deeper into this data. This is unpublished raw data at the moment to try to look at what the content of that people are generating, to try to then feed back this information to the organizations. What is it that is most important to this population, to potentially continue integrating this type of thing with their existing programs. Okay, so to wrap up, I'd like to just emphasize the point that affirmations are not the cause of any of these changes. Some of the, whether it's reduction in stress, and other studies, improvement in academic performance or greater adherence to the recommendations. I think it's best to think about them affirmations or as motivational interventions that can be catalysts that unleash the effects of other positive things in the environment. That in the alcohol study, it enabled the implementation intentions and the information that was presented to be acted on and effective. Okay, it wasn't just that the affirmation by itself sort of magically led to these changes, but it reduced a psychological barrier that may have been preventing people from taking advantage of the information that was out there, that was presented to them. This has been an interesting area of research, in part because self-threats are so ubiquitous. We've looked at this, and today I focused on the health domain, but in other work we've looked at it in terms of educational threats, responding to stigma. We've looked at it in the context of intergroup conflict and in terms of relationship difficulties. And in all of these cases, there's potential for the people's self-image to see themselves as being capable and adaptive people to be on the line. Self-threats are ubiquitous, and affirmation is one way with which people can cope with them. Lastly, we've spent a lot of time, and I didn't get fully into it, but I'm happy to elaborate a little more in Q&A about the mechanisms of affirmation. It brings online key resources that people don't typically think about when they're experiencing threats. It brings online these other important self-resources. And when it does, it enables people cognitively to see things from a bigger picture, to see things from a broader perspective. And that understanding from a lot of the mechanistic lab studies has helped us understand when, why, and how these affirmations can lead potentially to lasting change. With that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention. Acknowledge my collaborators and the funding agencies. I'm happy to take questions.